What do the Bronte sisters, Ringo Starr, and Robert Oppenheimer all have in common? They all had tuberculosis. In fact, a surprisingly high number of things are intrinsically linked to tuberculosis. The city of Pasadena, California, for example, only really exists because of tuberculosis. In the late 19th and 20th century, Pasadena was basically created to serve people with TB because of its dry, arid air, which was mythologized to be good for people with tuberculosis. Dry, arid air is also the reason why Robert Oppenheimer decided to build the nuclear bomb in New Mexico, because the dry, arid air there was supposed to help him with his tuberculosis. An even more unusual link to tuberculosis is the look of Tim Burton characters. And no, the link is not that Tim Burton's initials are TB, but instead the link is with the design of his characters. Tim Burton characters are easily recognizable anywhere in the world due to their wiry frames, their pale skin, and wide eyes. For example, Sally in A Nightmare Before Christmas. But you know what else gives you a thin frame, pale skin, and wide eyes? Tuberculosis, and that link is not a coincidence. Tim Burton has stated in the past that one of his greatest influences is Edgar Allan Poe, whose own writing and perception of beauty was heavily influenced by his mother, who had wide eyes, pale skin, and a thin frame because his mother, Eliza Poe, had tuberculosis. Now, if you read John Green's book, the number of examples of connections to TB like this goes on, and it is truly extraordinary. But that begs the question, why? Well, it's probably because millions of people have suffered and died from tuberculosis for thousands of years, since the time of ancient Egypt. So many, in fact, that TB has been the world's #1 deadliest infectious disease for most of human history. There were a few exceptions to this rule. Notably, in 1350, the Black Death overtook tuberculosis for a few years, and then quite recently, COVID-19 also overtook tuberculosis as the world's deadliest infectious disease. But before and after these events, and for the hundreds of years in between, tuberculosis has been the #1 deadliest infectious disease. It's just been this quiet force of nature slowly shaping humanity and society around it, which is why so many things about our culture are surprisingly linked directly to tuberculosis. And today, tuberculosis is still the world's #1 deadliest infectious disease, killing 1.3 million people this year. But killing over 1 million people this year is not even the crazy part. The crazy part is that unlike when COVID first came on the scene and started infecting and killing people, we have a cure for TB. It's been curable since 1955, yet here we are decades later and still letting it kill over 1 million people per year, letting over 1 million people die of a curable infectious disease. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about TB, how absurd it is that this curable disease kills so many people every year, how this has come to be, and what some people are doing about it. Now, if you're from a rich nation like I am, you probably don't think much about tuberculosis. You don't have it, no one you know personally has it, so it doesn't cross your mind very often. And as you might have suspected, most of the deaths from TB are in poor nations. But before you click off and think that this doesn't affect you where you are, think again, because by allowing tuberculosis to fester abroad in poor nations, we have increased the risk of tuberculosis coming to rich nations. You see, tuberculosis is a bacteria, and bacteria don't acknowledge political borders, they don't acknowledge GDP levels, they will go wherever they want if they aren't shut down. And if you don't believe me, check out this story on Ground News. So Ground News are kindly sponsoring today's video, and we both agreed to donate all of the money to Partners in Health, a non-profit working to fight tuberculosis in Sierra Leone, one of the countries with the highest mortality rates for tuberculosis. And what's even better is that the donation is sufficiently large that John and Hank Green will actually match it as well. So let me tell you about this story that I found on Ground News recently. Tuberculosis cases in the US rose to their highest levels in more than a dozen years. I can see that this story has over 50 sources covering it, and reading Ground News' summary, I quickly learned that the WHO has called for urgent action to address worldwide disruptions in tuberculosis services, which are endangering millions of lives, and funding cuts from the United States disrupt community-based TB services, which disproportionately affect vulnerable children, leading to a rise in undiagnosed cases and avoidable deaths. I love these bullet point summaries from Ground News, and if you haven't heard of Ground News before, let me tell you a bit more about them. So Ground News is an app and website that gathers sources from around the world and brings them into one place so that you can have more context to the news that you're reading. Which is why Ground News is my favorite way to consume the news these days, because they stop me from over-relying on only one or two sources, which is what I used to do. As a result, result, that means that my news diet is now much more balanced and objective. When I read stories like this one on rising TB cases in the United States, I can see how they're being covered across the political spectrum. I get to see the political leanings of each outlet, how factual they are, and who owns each source. Personally, I like to prioritize high factuality sources and read a diverse range of perspectives to get the most context on the story that I'm reading. In my opinion, this is just a much better way to read the news, and it's only made possible thanks to Ground. So if you want to try it out for yourself, they are giving my viewers 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan that gives you access to all of the features that I use. You can subscribe using my link in the description, the pinned comment, or using the QR code on screen now. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video and for supporting partners in health. Let's carry on and talk more about tuberculosis. So let's start off by talking about what tuberculosis is medically and explain why it took so long to develop a cure, even though it was so deadly for so many years. So medically speaking, tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And the symptoms caused by this bacteria are things like coughing, chest pain, coughing up blood, a loss of appetite, hence the emaciated look of Tim Burton characters. There are other symptoms too, but just know that, in general, it's a terrible and horrible time. And of course, it is deadly if it's left untreated. But despite these obvious signs of the disease, Mycobacterium tuberculosis has a frustratingly unique set of properties that make it particularly hard to diagnose and treat. In particular, the thing that causes problems is TB's thick, waxy coating that makes the bacteria hydrophobic. You see, usually when we want to diagnose a respiratory disease like this, we'll put a bit of sputum on a petri dish with agar and see what grows. But if you try and do that for someone with TB, it won't grow at all. So that's why it was so easy for doctors to miss cases of TB for so long. And actually for a long time, people thought for this reason that it was hereditary and not something caused by a bacteria. Nowadays, we know that if you do think somebody has TB, you have to try and culture the bacteria in a specifically rich medium that is conducive for TB. And not every healthcare facility has access to this, and so oftentimes it goes undiagnosed. The other thing that makes it annoying to diagnose is the fact that tuberculosis grows really slowly. Other bacteria like E. coli, for example, will show up on a petri dish within hours, but if you try and grow tuberculosis, even in the correct specific rich medium, it can take days or even weeks for anything to show up. So that's why it's hard to diagnose, but the thick waxy coating also leads to another problem, which is the way that it interacts with our immune system. You see, TB has this annoying ability to stay dormant in someone's lungs for years and years and basically their whole life. Your immune system will wall off tuberculosis in the lungs, creating these things called tubercles, and these can lie dormant in your lungs until at some point your immune system becomes compromised again, and then they reinfect you and make you sick again. This is actually the reason why my grandmother had some difficulty getting a visa recently. You see, she actually had tuberculosis when she was young, but she hasn't had any tuberculosis symptoms for 30 to 40 years. But because tuberculosis has this annoying ability to form tubercles in the lungs, they still had to check to make sure that these tubercles weren't going to become active again if she ever had a compromised immune system when she traveled. And finally, and crucially, perhaps the most annoying thing about tuberculosis is that if it isn't dealt with quickly and decisively, it has the chance to mutate into what's called multi-drug resistant TB, or MDR-TB. And as you might suspect, this means that this TB will no longer respond to the normal course of treatment, which we'll talk about in a second, and your chance of survival from MDR-TB drops dramatically. If you have normal tuberculosis and you're given the normal cure for it, you have about an 85-90% chance of survival within the first 6 months. But if your tuberculosis develops into multi-drug resistant TB, then your chance of survival drops to about 50%. So preventing tuberculosis from developing into multi-drug resistant TB is absolutely crucial for people's survival. And the truth is that, to be honest, tuberculosis should never really be allowed to get to this stage. And the reason for that is because the cures for TB have been invented for a long time. They're manufactured, they're well understood by the medical community. The cure for TB is called the RIPE protocol, RIPE being an acronym for the 4 antibiotics you see on the screen right now. And if people take the RIPE protocol every day for the full course of the antibiotics, the full amount of time that they're supposed to, the chances of TB developing into MDR-TB should be very low. But of course, not everybody does get the proper dose, or they do not take it for the full course that they're supposed to. And that's really where the problem lies. Now, when you hear that the problem is that people aren't taking the full course of their medication, you might be tempted to think that this is a problem of willpower or a lack of discipline, and that really it's their fault. The onus is on them for not being disciplined enough to take their medication properly. But I really don't think that that's fair, because when you read John Green's book and you learn a bit more about the context in which these people live, it actually becomes perfectly understandable why they don't take the full course of their antibiotics. I know that certainly if I was in their shoes, I too would really struggle to take the full course of the antibiotics. So let me give you some examples of why people might struggle to take their antibiotics properly. Perhaps one of the most poignant examples that is most memorable for me from John Green's book is when he talks about the hunger. So people who have tuberculosis typically experience a suppressed appetite, hence why people suffering from tuberculosis tend to look really thin, hence the emaciated frames and the skinny look of Tim Burton characters. But what happens when you take the antibiotics is that your hunger then comes back, and according to the people who take it, when it comes back, it roars back. Now, a roaring appetite isn't such a big problem if you live in a very food-secure nation like the United States or Europe or Australia. In nations like that, we have no issues with food supply. In fact, we probably have too much access to food, if anything. But when you're from a poor country with a lot of food insecurity, then a roaring hunger becomes a real problem. For many people who experience it, they just simply cannot find enough food to satisfy their hunger. And the symptom of the hunger becomes completely unbearable, and as a result, they stop taking their medication. It's just too hard to live with the hunger. Another major problem is hospital access. If I want to go see a doctor, we're talking about a 5-minute drive to my local medical practice. But for people in these poor nations who are suffering from tuberculosis, they're often having to travel much, much longer. And this is a big problem because you see, the way that the right protocol is usually administered in these poor countries is that people don't take the antibiotics home and then are trusted to take them every single day. Instead, they are required to come into the hospital every single day and take the medication in front of a medical staff. And the reason why they mandate that is because adherence to the protocol is so important. So the hospital staff want to know and visually confirm that these people are taking their medication every single day. And this would be a huge hassle for anyone, even for me with my local doctor being only 5 minutes away. But for people in these poor nations, which have poorer infrastructure, poorer roads, and just less hospitals in general, sometimes we're talking about a 2-hour trip to get to the hospital. So when you're talking about a 2-hour trip, well, then suddenly this daily journey becomes not just an inconvenience, but actually it starts to get in the way of other aspects of your life, like, for example, your job. And if you're asking people to choose between keeping their job and taking their medication, well, a lot of people can't afford to lose their job. And so guess what? They don't take their medication, and either they die of tuberculosis or they stop taking their medication, their tuberculosis turns into multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and then they die. And finally, there's the cost of the drugs. The cost of these drugs is often too high for the hospitals that need them to buy enough of it. And a high proportion of the cost of these drugs comes from pharmaceutical companies holding the patent to them. And while I appreciate the need for companies, including pharmaceutical companies, to make a profit on the work that they do, there comes a point where you have to ask the question, like, is this ethical business practice, or are you just profiteering off people suffering? For example, Johnson & Johnson had a patent on a drug called bedaquiline, which is a key drug in fighting multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And that patent was due to expire in 2023, but Johnson & Johnson filed for secondary patents that would effectively evergreen their patent on bedaquiline. If they were successful, this would prevent cheaper generic versions of the same drug being made that could compete with Johnson & Johnson. But thankfully, thanks to activists in India and John Green and John Green's fans, Johnson & Johnson decided to back down and not enforce their secondary patents, which effectively dropped the price of bedaquiline by like 60%. Essentially overnight, which will result in countless lives being saved. So to end on a more hopeful note, people are doing something about it. Partners in Health, the nonprofit who this video's sponsorship money is going to, are one such organization. But John Green also writes about Search, Treat, Prevent programs, or STP initiatives as they're known. These are programs that search household by household for tuberculosis, diagnose the people that they find, and then give them the appropriate course of antibiotics depending on if they have regular tuberculosis or multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And apparently programs like this have already proven really effective in places like Karachi and Lesotho. So hopefully with more successful case studies like this, a worldwide program can be rolled out soon. Because as John Green says in his book,
the cure is where the disease is not, and the disease is where the cure is not.
So hopefully TB won't be a problem forever, but it really shouldn't be a problem now. But to beat TB, it requires our attention, our empathy, and frankly, our money. So thank you for watching today's video. Thank you to Ground News for supporting this channel and for supporting Partners in Health. And subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.